In every marriage, there are moments of betrayal, heartbreak, and secrets. But when those secrets become unbearable, the consequences can be far more tragic than anyone could ever imagine. What happens when the person you trust the most, the person you've sworn your life to, betrays you in the most unimaginable way? This is the chilling story of one woman's ultimate revenge, a crime so shocking that it would send ripples through her community, shattering her once perfect life. What began as a fairy tale romance soon turned into a deadly web of deceit, obsession, and, ultimately, murder. This is the story of a woman who executed her husband for cheating. This is the story of vengeance at its most extreme, and the ultimate reckoning that would leave everyone wondering, how far will someone go to protect their pride and dignity? Their names were Claire and Thomas Calloway, seemingly the perfect couple. Thomas, a well-respected lawyer in his late 30s, had it all: success, wealth, and a beautiful wife. Claire, in her early 30s, was every bit the picture of grace and elegance. They had a house that could be seen from miles away, perched on a hill with a view of the city's skyline. They had 2 beautiful children, a perfect family that everyone admired. From the outside, Claire and Thomas lived a dream life. But what most didn't know was that their marriage, like so many others, was built on a foundation of secrets. Secrets that, over time, would prove to be the cracks in the armor of their seemingly perfect life. For Claire, those cracks began to appear when she started noticing subtle changes in Thomas's behavior. He had always been the attentive husband, the caring father, but suddenly, there were late nights at the office, missed calls, and a detachment that Claire couldn't ignore. At first, she brushed it off as stress from his job, but as weeks turned into months, her suspicions grew. Claire, a woman known for her sharp intuition, began to put the pieces together. She had always been protective of her family, keeping a close eye on her husband's activities. But the truth she was about to uncover was far worse than she could have imagined. One fateful evening, Claire decided to confront her husband. She had been suspicious for long enough, and the feeling of betrayal was eating away at her. After putting the kids to bed, she sat Thomas down in their luxurious living room, their eyes locked in a silent battle. The weight of her questions hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "Thomas," she began, her voice steady but laced with tension, "I know something's been going on. You've been distant. You've been hiding things from me. Are you having an affair?" Thomas's face went pale. Claire could see the flicker of guilt in his eyes, the brief hesitation before he tried to deny it. But it was too late. The truth had already begun to emerge, and Claire wasn't about to let him lie anymore. I don't know what you're talking about," Thomas stammered, his usual confidence slipping. But Claire had seen through him. "Don't lie to me, Thomas. I know you're seeing someone else. I've seen the texts, the calls, the late nights. It's been going on for months now, hasn't it?" The silence between them was deafening. Thomas finally dropped his gaze, his shoulders sagging with the weight of his shame. "Yes," he whispered. "I've been seeing someone. I'm sorry, Claire. It just happened. I never meant for you to find out this way." For Claire, those words were a dagger to the heart. The man she had loved, the father of her children, had betrayed her in the worst possible way. And the woman he had been seeing? Claire knew her. She was a former client of Thomas's, someone Claire had trusted, someone she had welcomed into their home. But it wasn't just the affair that hurt. It was the lies, the deceit. The fact that Thomas had been living a double life for months, all while pretending to be the loving husband and father he never truly was. Claire's mind began to spiral. Betrayal like this wasn't something she could just forgive. It wasn't something she could ignore. In that moment, something inside her snapped. A coldness washed over her, and the woman who had once been the loving wife and mother now felt consumed by a burning need for revenge. She couldn't just let this go. Thomas had wronged her in the most intimate way possible, and now, Claire vowed, he would pay the price. The weeks following Thomas's confession were filled with a heavy silence. Claire appeared to be the same loving wife, the same devoted mother. But behind closed doors, a darker side of her emerged. She started researching. She started planning. The betrayal had ignited something deep inside of her, a desire to make Thomas suffer for what he had done. She began collecting evidence, photos, phone records, texts, everything that would prove to the world that Thomas had destroyed their family. But that wasn't enough. No, Claire wanted more. She needed him to feel the pain she felt, to understand the devastation he had caused her. In her mind, there was only one way to make him understand: to take everything from him, to ruin him the way he had ruined her. Revenge had become an obsession, and she was willing to do whatever it took to make it happen. Claire was methodical in her planning. She knew Thomas's every move, his schedule, his habits. She had always been attentive to their life together, but now her attention was laser-focused on the one thing that mattered most to her: vengeance. She spent days devising the perfect way to make her husband pay for his infidelity. She knew exactly what she had to do. It started with a weekend getaway. Claire suggested they take a trip together, just the two of them, to try and mend their broken relationship. Thomas, eager to make things right, agreed. What he didn't know was that Claire wasn't planning on mending anything. She was planning on ending everything. The destination was a secluded cabin in the woods, isolated, quiet, and far away from prying eyes. Claire made sure everything was in place. She made sure Thomas was comfortable and relaxed, unaware of the storm that was brewing. That night, as they sat down for a romantic dinner, Claire could see the guilt in Thomas's eyes. He tried to act normal, tried to act like the man he once was, but Claire could see right through him. He wasn't the same, and neither was she. After dinner, as they retired to their room, Claire executed the final step of her plan. The details were blurred, but the outcome was not. In a sudden, brutal moment of rage and betrayal, Claire took matters into her own hands. The silence of the cabin was shattered by the sound of violence. When the police arrived the following morning, Claire was sitting quietly on the porch of the cabin, her face calm, almost serene. She had done it. She had executed her husband, and with it, her own twisted sense of justice. She had made him pay for the pain he had caused. The police were initially stunned by the scene they encountered. Thomas's body was found lifeless in the bedroom, and Claire, the grieving widow, appeared to be in shock, unaware of the gravity of the situation. At first, Claire's story seemed plausible. She had told the officers that Thomas had been violent, that he had come at her in a fit of rage, and she had acted in self-defense. But as the investigation unfolded, the cracks in her story began to show. Claire's calm demeanor, her lack of real emotion, raised suspicions. And when the evidence was uncovered, it was clear this was no act of self-defense. Claire had executed her husband in cold blood, and the true reason for his death was now coming to light. The affair, the betrayal, and the vengeful rage that had consumed her had led to this tragic end. As Claire was taken into custody, the truth about her dark, twisted need for revenge was laid bare. But was Claire truly a victim of her own emotions, or had she carefully planned the perfect crime? Was she driven by love, or was this simply the cold, calculated revenge of a woman scorned? The police had initially assumed the case was straightforward. A tragic love story gone wrong, the desperate final act of a woman pushed too far by her husband's infidelity. But the more the investigators dug into Claire's past, the more unsettling details began to emerge. Claire's life had seemed perfect on the surface. She was known in the community as a loving wife, a doting mother, and an active participant in her children's school and extracurricular activities. But as the investigation progressed, it became clear that Claire was hiding a much darker side. The woman who had once seemed like the picture of grace and beauty had built her life on a bed of lies, and now, those lies were unraveling piece by piece. The first red flag came when detectives discovered a series of unsettling phone records and messages. They found evidence that Claire had been planning her husband's murder long before the weekend getaway. In the weeks leading up to the trip, Claire had been secretly researching ways to commit the perfect crime: how to kill her husband, how to stage it to look like an accident, and how to cover her tracks. Her obsession with revenge had taken a dangerous turn. Claire had meticulously planned the night of the murder, making sure to create the perfect environment: a secluded cabin far from their home, a romantic dinner that would lull Thomas into a false sense of security, and a violent, deadly confrontation that would end with his life. The murder weapon itself was another chilling detail that painted a damning picture of Claire's premeditated actions. The knife Claire had used to kill her husband wasn't just any ordinary kitchen knife. It had been carefully chosen. The blade was long, sharp, and capable of causing maximum damage. It was clear that Claire had taken her time in selecting the right weapon, and the brutal nature of the crime only reinforced the idea that this was not a spur-of-the-moment act of self-defense. As the police continued their investigation, they discovered that Claire had even taken steps to ensure that the crime would go undetected for as long as possible. She had planned to leave the cabin immediately after Thomas's death, driving back home and pretending to be in shock. But the investigators soon realized that Claire had underestimated one crucial element: the evidence. A trail of blood, an oddly positioned body, and the lack of any signs of struggle led the detectives to believe that this wasn't a crime of self-defense. It was an execution. Claire had killed Thomas with calculated precision, her mind set on one thing: revenge. And in her cold-hearted execution of that revenge, she had sealed her fate. One of the most disturbing aspects of the investigation was Claire's reaction to her husband's death. While some might have expected her to be devastated by the loss of the man she had once loved, Claire remained eerily composed. The police officers who interrogated her were struck by her lack of emotion. There were no tears, no signs of guilt, no visible signs of the devastation one might expect from a grieving widow. Instead, Claire seemed almost detached, as if she had already come to terms with what had happened. Her calm demeanor and seemingly controlled responses made the investigators question her state of mind. Was she really the victim in all of this, or had she orchestrated her husband's death with cold-blooded calculation? As the days passed, it became more and more apparent that Claire's actions were not motivated by a momentary loss of control, but by something deeper, a deep-seated desire for power, for retribution, and for validation. As the case unfolded, Claire's true motive began to reveal itself. It wasn't just the affair. It wasn't just the betrayal. What Claire had really been after was something much darker: control. In the months before the murder, Claire had become obsessed with the idea of Thomas's infidelity. She had convinced herself that he had destroyed their perfect life, that he had humiliated her in front of their family and friends, and that she needed to make him pay. But beyond that, Claire's motive was rooted in a deeper sense of inadequacy. She had spent years building a perfect life, constructing an image of success and happiness. But when Thomas's affair came to light, it threatened everything she had worked so hard to create. The perfect family, the perfect marriage, the perfect life, all of it was in jeopardy. And Claire couldn't stand the thought of losing it. Her rage wasn't just about the betrayal. It was about losing control over her life, over her image, over her sense of self-worth. Thomas's affair had been the breaking point, but Claire's real struggle had been with the fear of being exposed for the fraud she had become. As Claire's trial date approached, the case became one of the most talked about stories in the media. People were captivated by the idea of a woman who had killed her husband for the sake of revenge, and the press eagerly followed every detail of the case. The narrative of the betrayed wife who took justice into her own hands resonated with many, but it also sparked outrage. How could anyone justify such a brutal act? But Claire wasn't interested in the public's opinion. As her arrest and trial loomed, she remained unrepentant, convinced that she had done what was necessary. She was determined to present herself as a woman who had been wronged, a woman who had taken matters into her own hands after being pushed to the brink. But as the prosecution presented its evidence, Claire's carefully crafted defense began to unravel. The trial was a spectacle, a battle between the defense and prosecution, with Claire's fate hanging in the balance. Her defense attorneys argued that Claire's actions had been driven by years of emotional abuse and manipulation, painting her as a victim of her circumstances. But the prosecution was relentless, arguing that Claire had orchestrated her husband's murder with chilling precision, and that her desire for revenge had blinded her to any sense of morality. The courtroom was filled with tension as both sides presented their cases. The prosecution highlighted the premeditated nature of the crime, pointing to Claire's meticulous planning and cold execution. The defense, on the other hand, argued that Claire had been driven to madness by the betrayal, and that her actions had been a desperate attempt to reclaim her life. But despite the defense's efforts, the evidence against Claire was overwhelming. The key witness was the 911 call she had made after the murder. In that call, Claire's voice was calm, almost too calm. She claimed that her husband had been violent with her, but the inconsistencies in her story were glaring. It was clear to the jury that Claire had planned and carried out the murder with cold, calculating intent. As the trial continues, Claire's future hangs in the balance. Will she be convicted of first-degree murder, Or will her defense succeed in convincing the jury that her actions were the result of emotional turmoil and betrayal? The courtroom awaits the final verdict, and Claire's life is about to change forever. But there are still unanswered questions. What truly motivated Claire to go so far? Was it love, or was it something darker? And as the trial reaches its conclusion, the question remains: can anyone truly seek justice for such a horrific crime, or is vengeance a force too powerful to be reckoned with? The jury had heard everything, every shred of evidence, every word of testimony, every piece of Claire's carefully crafted defense. Now, they sat in a deliberation room, weighing the fate of a woman who had taken the life of her husband, a man she once swore to love forever. As the hours stretched on, the tension in the room was palpable. Some jurors believed that Claire had acted out of love, driven to madness by the crushing betrayal of her husband's affair. Others felt that Claire had manipulated her emotions to justify a crime of cold calculation. The question they faced wasn't just about guilt. It was about whether Claire's revenge could ever be justified, no matter the circumstances. But there was something else lingering in the air, the same thing that had haunted the courtroom throughout the trial: Claire's unwavering composure. Her lack of remorse, her stoic expression, and the chilling way she had recounted the murder made it difficult for many to see her as the victim she portrayed herself to be. The more they thought about it, the more it became clear Claire had executed her husband with a precision and calmness that suggested premeditation, not emotional breakdown. In her final defense, Claire took the stand one last time. Her voice was steady, almost serene, as she recounted the events of that fateful night once more. She spoke of the years of emotional abuse she had endured, the constant betrayal, and the overwhelming pain of discovering her husband's affair. She spoke of her desire for closure, for justice, and for a life free from the shadow of Thomas's infidelity. "I loved him," she said softly, "but he betrayed me in the worst way possible. I didn't just kill him because of his affair. I killed him because he stole my future. He took away my sense of self-worth. And in that moment, I had nothing left." Her words echoed in the courtroom. To some, they seemed like a plea for sympathy. To others, they sounded like a justification for murder. As Claire finished her testimony, the silence in the room was deafening. The jury would have to decide: was Claire's sense of betrayal enough to make her actions excusable? Or was she simply a woman driven by cold calculation and a desire for power? The courtroom was packed as the jury returned to deliver their verdict. The air was thick with anticipation. Claire sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. She had spent the past several days in a state of cold determination, awaiting the decision that would determine the rest of her life. And now, it was finally time. The judge called for silence as the jury foreman stood, a man Claire had not yet seen flinch or move in the past few days. His eyes met Claire's briefly before he turned to the judge. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Claire Matthews, guilty of first-degree murder." A gasp swept through the courtroom. Claire's face remained unchanged, her lips pressed tightly together as the words sank in. She had expected this outcome. She knew it was coming, but hearing it spoken aloud, in front of the room full of strangers, hit her like a wave. She had killed her husband, and now she would pay the price. But even in the face of her conviction, Claire didn't break. She didn't sob or show any sign of the emotion that many believed she should have. She stood, her shoulders straight, as the judge instructed the bailiffs to take her into custody. Claire was escorted back to the holding cell, the gravity of her actions finally beginning to settle in. The world she had carefully built was now shattered. Her family was gone. Her children were in the custody of relatives, and her name would be forever associated with the murder of her husband. The whispers of betrayal and revenge would follow her for the rest of her life. But Claire didn't regret what she had done. In her mind, Thomas had taken everything from her, and in the end, he had paid the ultimate price for his infidelity. She had executed him, not just for the affair, but for the years of humiliation, the emotional manipulation, and the lies. In her mind, she was the victim, and Thomas's death was the only justice she could attain. As the trial came to a close, Claire was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was filled with a sense of finality as the judge handed down the sentence. But for Claire, there was no sense of loss, only a cold, resolute acceptance. The woman who had once been the beloved wife and mother was now a prisoner, sentenced for a crime she believed she had every right to commit. Months passed, and the story of Claire's brutal revenge continued to make headlines. The public's fascination with her case never seemed to wane, with many divided over whether her actions were justified. Some sympathized with Claire, understanding her need to reclaim her dignity and punish the man who had betrayed her. Others saw her as a woman who had allowed her obsession with revenge to destroy everything she once held dear. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Claire's story was the fact that she never truly seemed to understand the full consequences of her actions. Throughout the trial, she never once showed genuine remorse for the man she had killed. Her love for him, it seemed, had been completely overshadowed by her desire to control the narrative of her life, to regain the power that had been stripped from her by his affair. As Claire's story faded from the headlines, people were left to grapple with the question: can any crime be truly justified if it's born from betrayal? And when revenge takes control, is it possible for anyone to stop the cycle of violence before it consumes everything? Claire Matthews' life is now a cautionary tale, a story of how love, obsession, and vengeance can spiral out of control. Her cold, calculated act of revenge serves as a haunting reminder of the depths to which someone can sink when they believe they have been wronged. For Claire, the price of her actions was steep. She traded her family, her future, and her freedom for a moment of perceived justice. In the end, the true cost of revenge is something that no one can ever truly escape. Was Claire justified in taking matters into her own hands? Or was she simply a victim of her own uncontrollable need for control and power? The truth may never be fully understood, but the consequences of Claire's actions are undeniable. This is a story of love, betrayal, and the chilling power of obsession. For more shocking true crime stories, make sure to subscribe to Dark True Crime Stories.